I gave this statement once before, in a room that smelled like cold coffee and printer toner. 3 officers sat across from me, none of them speaking for the first 20 minutes. They just listened to the recording of the night shift logs from Camp Bastion and watched my face. One of them eventually said something that stuck with me. "Just start at the beginning, Sergeant." So that's what I'm doing here. Camp Bastion sat in the middle of the Helmand Desert in southern Afghanistan, a patchwork of gravel runways, HESCO barriers, and tan prefabricated structures that looked temporary but somehow managed to survive years of war. By 2012 the base had grown into something closer to a city. British command ran the core sectors, but NATO units rotated through constantly, US Marines, Danish engineers, Georgian infantry, even small detachments from Estonia and Latvia. I was with the US Marine Corps Combat Logistics Battalion, attached to engineering support. My job was simple: supervise ground maintenance crews responsible for keeping drainage trenches and utility corridors clear beneath the southern sectors of the base. Nothing about it was glamorous. It meant crawling through concrete culverts, checking buried cable runs, and clearing sand that the desert wind pushed into every open seam of the installation. The locals had another name for that area. They called it the hollow ground. At the time, none of us cared. The first report came from a British private on night guard rotation. He logged it in the incident ledger like it was a joke. "Possible screaming heard beneath southern maintenance trench." The officer on duty wrote it off as wind moving through the drainage tunnels. That was normal out there. At night the desert temperature could drop 20 degrees in less than an hour. Air pushed through the culverts and produced sounds that carried in strange ways. Whistling. Groaning. Sometimes a long, hollow echo that sounded almost like a human voice. Nobody thought twice about it. Until the dogs started reacting. Camp Bastion had feral dogs living along the outer perimeter. They survived off discarded food and the occasional unlucky rodent. They were noisy animals. Always barking. Always fighting. But sometime around the second week of August they stopped. The sentries noticed it first. Instead of barking toward the wire like they usually did, the dogs began pacing along the southern maintenance trench, whining and refusing to cross over it. Some of them stood there staring down into the concrete drainage grates for hours. One night a corporal tossed a ration bar down into the trench just to see what they'd do. The dogs backed away. None of them touched it. The smell came next. That's when engineering got involved. We received a maintenance request from the British Utilities section saying there was a persistent odor rising from the underground channels near Sector Delta. They thought it might be a damaged waste line. The smell wasn't sewage, though. I remember that clearly. It was colder than that. Dry. Like the air inside a stone cellar that had been sealed for a very long time. Almost metallic. The kind of smell that settles in the back of your throat. Underscore 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 underscore. My team ran a routine inspection the following morning. Standard procedure. 2 Marines on entry, 1 on comms, 1 maintaining surface watch. We lifted the drainage grate and dropped a portable floodlight down into the tunnel. The culvert stretched about 30 meters before bending beneath the base infrastructure. It was an old Soviet-era channel, poured concrete reinforced with rebar. The British had simply incorporated it into the base drainage system when Bastion was built. I climbed down first. The air inside was colder than outside. Not drastically. Just enough to notice. Sand coated the floor in a thin layer, except for a narrow path running down the center where something had disturbed it. At first I thought it was water runoff. Then I looked closer. They weren't watermarks. They were tracks. But they didn't look like animal prints. Or boot prints. They were long, narrow impressions spaced too far apart to belong to anything walking normally. More like something dragging itself. underscore 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 underscore. Probably stray dogs getting inside, one of the Marines behind me said. Maybe. Except the tracks ran deeper into the tunnel. And none of them came back out. Underscore 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 underscore. We followed the culvert for about 20 meters before the smell got stronger. Not worse. Just heavier. Like stale air being pushed toward us. That's when we heard the sound. It was faint. Just a vibration moving through the concrete. Almost like someone talking through a wall several rooms away. One of the Marines stopped walking. "Sergeant, you hear that?" I held up a hand. We listened. At first it sounded like wind again. Then the tone shifted. For a second, just a second, it resembled a voice. Not a word. More like the shape of a scream stretched so thin it had lost its meaning. We logged the tunnel as structurally unstable and sealed the grate until a full inspection could be scheduled. No one wanted Marines crawling through old Soviet drainage systems unless they absolutely had to. For 2 days nothing happened. Then the power fluctuation started. The southern sector generators tripped 3 times in one night. Electrical technicians said it looked like interference on the buried cable lines. They checked for damage. There wasn't any. But every time the generators restarted, the interference returned. Always around the same coordinates. Directly above the drainage system we'd inspected. That's when the screams were reported again. Not by one soldier. By 6. Different posts. Different shifts. All describing the same thing. A distant human scream rising from underground. Sometimes lasting only a few seconds. Sometimes stretching for nearly half a minute. Always stopping the moment someone tried to pinpoint the location. Command finally authorized a full engineering sweep. Not because they believed the reports. Because they were worried insurgents might be using the old tunnels to approach the base perimeter. So the next night we went back down there. This time with more equipment. And more people. We entered through the same grate in Sector Delta. 5 Marines. 2 British engineers. 1 interpreter. The interpreter's name was Hamid. He grew up in Helmand and worked with NATO forces for years translating between local contractors and military staff. When he saw the tunnel entrance, he went quiet. I asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer right away. He just stared down into the darkness beneath the floodlight. Finally he said something in Pashto. One of the British engineers asked him to repeat it in English. Hamid hesitated. Then he said it slowly. "My grandfather told stories about places like this." "What kind of stories?" I asked. He pointed down the culvert. "The ground here is older than the war." That wasn't surprising. Most of Afghanistan is layered with history. Greek ruins, Persian roads, Mongol battlefields, Soviet fortifications. But Hamid shook his head. "Older than that." We moved into the tunnel. The air felt colder than before. Not by much. But enough that our breath fogged faintly in the beam of the floodlights. The tracks in the sand were still there. But they had changed. There were more of them now. Not just one trail. Several. Running deeper beneath the base. One of the engineers crouched down to photograph the impressions. "Probably water flow patterns," he said. But he didn't sound convinced. Because the marks curved. Water doesn't curve like that. One of the Marines shined a flashlight down the hole. The beam didn't reach the bottom. The light simply faded into darkness. Then the screaming started again. This time there was no mistaking it. It came from below. Not loud, but unmistakably human. A long, drawn-out cry rising through the shaft like something trying to force its way upward. Everyone froze. No one spoke. We just listened. The scream lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. The British engineer finally broke it. Could be air pressure moving through a lower chamber. That explanation satisfied exactly nobody. Because the scream had contained something mechanical. Not like machinery. Like a voice repeating a pattern. As if the sound itself had been trapped and was playing back through the stone. Hamid stepped away from the hole. His hands were shaking. "I told you," he said. "What did you tell us?" I asked. He looked at each of us before answering. "The villagers say the earth here remembers." No one laughed. Because right then we heard something else. Movement. Not from below. From behind us. Back down the tunnel we'd come through. The sand shifted. Slowly. As if something had just moved across it. But none of us had walked there in several minutes. And when we turned our lights toward the entrance, the tracks in the sand had changed again. They were moving closer. And that was the moment we realized something under Camp Bastion had started moving toward us. No one said anything for several seconds. 8 grown men standing in a cold stone chamber under a military base, watching the sand shift where no one had stepped. You don't expect the ground beneath a fortified installation to move. Camp Bastion had been engineered like a fortress. Layers of gravel, compacted soil, and reinforced concrete. Underground drainage channels mapped and inspected dozens of times since the base was established. Nothing was supposed to exist beneath it that we didn't already know about. Yet the tracks in the sand were moving. Not quickly. Just a slow change in shape, like something dragging itself forward inch by inch. The Calm's Marine leaned closer to the ground. "Wind?" he said quietly. There was no wind down there. The air inside the tunnel had been still since we entered. I felt the same cold pressure building in the back of my throat that we noticed before. That metallic smell again. Except stronger. It reminded me of rusted iron mixed with old stone. Hamid stepped farther away from the corridor entrance. His voice came out low. "It is awake now." The British engineer looked at him. "What's awake?" Hamid hesitated. Then he spoke slowly, as if translating something from memory rather than language. "In the old villages they say the ground here is not empty. They say the desert is layered like a body. Skin on top. Bone beneath it. And under the bone." He stopped. "What?" one of the Marines asked. Hamid looked down into the dark well behind us. "Under the bone is where the voices live." No one responded. Because the radio crackled again. This time it wasn't static. For a brief moment the headset speakers produced something else. A faint echo. Not words. But the same stretched scream we'd heard earlier. Only now it was coming through the radio. "Surface, this is Delta Maintenance Team," the Calm's Marine said into the microphone. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. The radio indicators showed signal transmission, but the sound coming back through the speaker was distorted. Like our own voices were being reflected from somewhere underground. One of the British engineers checked his handheld scanner. "Interference field," he muttered. "From what?" I asked. He didn't answer. Because right then the sand shifted again. The tracks that had been scattered along the tunnel floor were converging. Not toward the well. Toward us. I crouched down for a closer look. The impressions were long grooves, each one about 3 inches wide. They looked almost like something had been dragging a narrow length of rope through the sand. But the spacing didn't make sense. There were too many. And they were layered over each other. Whatever had made them had passed through the tunnel repeatedly. One of the Marines whispered behind me. "Sergeant!" I turned. He pointed down the corridor. The sand there was moving too. Not violently. Just a slow ripple. Like the ground itself was breathing. That's when the temperature dropped. It happened fast. A cold draft pushed through the chamber from the direction of the well, rolling across the floor like fog. Our breath started showing in the light. One of the Marines cursed under his breath. "Hellman doesn't get this cold at night." He was right. Even underground, the temperature difference shouldn't have been that dramatic. The engineer checked his digital thermometer. Dropped 8 degrees in less than 30 seconds. Something below us was pulling heat out of the air. Then the smell changed. The metallic scent became sharper, like oxidized blood. Hamid covered his nose with his sleeve. "This place was sealed once," he said quietly. "What do you mean sealed?" the engineer asked. Hamid gestured toward the stone walls. We turned our lights toward them. That's when we saw the markings. They were faint. So faint they blended into the natural texture of the stone. But once you noticed them, they were everywhere. Carved symbols. Curving lines intersecting in circular patterns. Not Arabic. Not Persian. Something older. One of the engineers ran his fingers across a groove. "Tool marks," he said. "Ancient? Hard to say. But the pattern was clear. Every symbol pointed toward the well in the center of the chamber. As if the carvings were meant to contain whatever lay beneath it. The screaming started again. But this time it wasn't a single voice. It was several. Layered together in a distant chorus rising from deep underground. Not loud. But unmistakably human. One Marine turned toward the well and raised his rifle instinctively. "Jesus!" The sound wasn't random. It followed a rhythm. Almost like breath. Long drawn-out cries rising together. Then fading. Then rising again. Hamid backed toward the corridor. "Those are not people," he whispered. "How do you know?" I asked. He looked directly at me. "Because the stories say the voices under the desert are older than men." At that point the British engineer made the only sensible call. "We need to mark this chamber and withdraw," he said. No one argued. We weren't archaeologists. And we definitely weren't prepared to investigate a deep subterranean shaft under a combat zone. But before we could move, something else happened. The sand near the well shifted violently. Not like the slow ripples we'd seen earlier. This time it jerked aside in a straight line, carving a fresh track across the floor. A long narrow groove. Moving directly toward the shaft. Like something unseen had just slid across the chamber. Everyone stepped back at the same time. The flashlight beams followed the track. It stopped right at the edge of the well. Then vanished. For several seconds nothing happened. The screaming below had stopped again. The tunnel was silent. Then the radio crackled. But the sound that came through wasn't static. It was a voice. My voice. Repeating something I had said earlier. "Delta Maintenance Team." The transmission looped once. Then again. But each repetition sounded slightly stretched. Lower. As if something underground was learning the shape of the words. "Turn that off," I told the comms Marine. He switched the radio off immediately. The echo stopped. But the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Like whatever was below had just lost its way to reach us. And might try again. We began backing toward the corridor. No one turned their back on the well. That's basic instinct in places like that. You maintain visual on the threat, even if you don't understand it. Halfway down the tunnel the cold air started fading. The temperature returned slowly. But the smell lingered. And the sand continued to shift behind us. Not aggressively. Just small movements. Like something pacing inside the ground. When we finally reached the concrete section of the culvert, the radio signal returned. Surface Control answered immediately. "Delta Team, you've been off comms for 10 minutes. Report status." 10 minutes. We had been underground nearly 40. No one said anything about that. Instead I gave the standard report. "Possible structural instability in lower chamber. Recommending restricted access until further inspection." The officer acknowledged and told us to return to surface. We climbed out through the drainage grate into the night air. The desert heat hit us like a wall. Normal temperature. Normal sound. The base lights stretched across the horizon exactly as they always had. For a moment it almost felt like nothing had happened. Until Hamid spoke again. "Sergeant." I turned. He was staring at the ground near the trench. "Look!" The sand outside the grate was disturbed. Not by our boots. By something else. A narrow track running away from the tunnel entrance. It stretched across the gravel maintenance road, then disappeared beneath the floodlights of Camp Bastion. That's when we realized something had followed us out. And it was already inside the base. For a few seconds none of us moved. We just stood there around the open trench, staring at the track cutting across the gravel road. It was the same kind of mark we had seen inside the tunnel. Long, narrow, dragged across the surface like something without legs had moved through the dust. Except this time the track wasn't buried in sand. It ran across compacted gravel. And gravel doesn't shift unless something heavy passes through it. The British engineer crouched down and ran his flashlight along the groove. The stones inside the track were polished smooth, like they had been dragged by something hard. Something that carried weight. "Could be equipment movement," he said. But there were no tire marks. No boot prints around it either. Just the track. And it led straight toward the interior of Camp Bastion. I ordered the team to cover the grate and report to command. Standard procedure again. Unknown subterranean access points near a military installation get sealed and investigated later by specialists. But the problem now wasn't the tunnel. It was whatever had just come out of it. The track disappeared about 30 meters from the trench where the gravel met one of the service roads leading deeper into the base. From there was nothing. No sign of where it went. Just normal ground. Normal tire ruts. Normal boot prints. The base lights buzzed overhead. Vehicles passed in the distance. Everything looked ordinary. But something about the silence around that trench felt wrong. Even the dogs were gone. Command treated the initial report as a possible insurgent infiltration route. Within an hour a small quick reaction team was sent to sweep the southern maintenance sector. Infrared scans. Perimeter checks. Motion sensors. Nothing unusual showed up. No movement underground. No heat signatures near the drainage tunnels. No disturbance along the outer perimeter fence. Officially, nothing had entered the base. Unofficially, 8 of us had seen the track. Around midnight the first internal incident happened. A maintenance contractor working in a generator shed reported hearing voices coming from beneath the concrete floor. At first he assumed someone was outside the building. But when he opened the door there was nobody there. The voices continued for another minute. Low. Muffled. Almost like people speaking underwater. Then they stopped. When the contractor bent down near the floor panels he heard something else. A faint dragging sound moving beneath the concrete. By 0100 hours 3 more reports came in. All from the southern half of the base. All describing the same thing. Sounds beneath the ground. Movement under buildings. And once, briefly, the sound of someone screaming from below the floor of a supply warehouse. Command shut down that entire section of Bastion for inspection. My team was called back in because we were the only ones who had been inside the tunnel. They wanted us to help identify where the underground channels ran beneath the structures. By the time we returned to Sector Delta the atmosphere around the place had changed. Floodlights had been repositioned. 2 British infantry squads were covering the area. The trench grate had been welded shut. No one was going back down there tonight. But the sound wasn't coming from the tunnel anymore. It was coming from somewhere else under the base. We started with the generator building where the contractor made his report. The structure sat about 70 meters from the trench entrance. Concrete slab foundation. Raised slightly above the surrounding gravel. I walked inside with 2 Marines and one of the engineers. The contractor was waiting outside. He refused to re-enter the building. Inside, everything looked normal. Generators humming. Fuel lines intact. No visible damage to the floor. But when the engineer placed his ear against the concrete slab, he froze. "You hear that?" he asked. I knelt down beside him. At first I heard nothing. Then the sound came through the floor. Faint. Very faint. A long, distant cry rising through the concrete. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then it faded again. The engineer slowly stood up. That's not mechanical. No one argued with him. If there were tunnels beneath the base that weren't on record, the radar would find them. The operator ran the first scan directly over the generator building. The screen lit up with the known drainage system immediately. Concrete channels. Utility conduits. All exactly where the base blueprints said they should be. Then something else appeared. A large hollow space. Much deeper than the drainage tunnels. And not on any map. The radar technician adjusted the depth setting. The chamber below us came into focus. It wasn't a tunnel. It was massive. A circular void carved into the earth nearly 20 meters beneath the base. Stone walls. Stone floor. And something else. Movement. Not clear shapes. Just shifting distortions across the floor of the chamber. As if multiple objects were slowly sliding across the stone. Could be groundwater movement, the technician said. But his voice didn't sound convinced. Because the distortions weren't random. They were moving toward one side of the chamber. Toward the direction of the old tunnel we had explored earlier. The same tunnel that had been sealed. Then the screaming started again. But this time everyone on the surface heard it. Not faint. Not distant. The sound came through the ground itself. A chorus of human cries rising together from deep beneath Camp Bastion. The soldiers outside the building stopped what they were doing. Several of them looked toward the ground instinctively. One of the Marines muttered something under his breath. Because the sound didn't feel like it was coming from below anymore. It felt like it was moving upward. The radar screen flickered. The distortions inside the underground chamber had changed direction. They were spreading outward. Toward the outer edges of the chamber walls. Toward the foundations of the base above. Like something down there had realized we were directly overhead. Then the floor beneath us vibrated. Not a violent shake. Just a slow pulse. One single movement of the earth beneath the concrete slab. Everyone inside the building felt it. Outside, one of the floodlight towers flickered. The radio channels filled with confused voices. Reports coming in from different sectors of the base. More sounds. More movement underground. One soldier claimed the ground near the aircraft maintenance hangars had started humming. Another reported hearing voices beneath the runway itself. The phenomenon wasn't isolated anymore. Whatever was below the base was spreading. Hamid grabbed my arm. His face had gone pale again. "They are waking," he said quietly. "Who?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead he pointed toward the ground radar screen. The technician had zoomed the image out. The chamber beneath us was only the center. More cavities extended outward beneath the desert. A network of underground spaces. Ancient. Massive. Buried far below the surface. Camp Bastion hadn't been built over empty ground. It had been built over something much older. Hamid finally spoke again. "When the Persians came through this land thousands of years ago, the villagers said they found places where the ground cried at night." I looked at him. "What did they do?" He swallowed. "They sealed the entrances." At that moment the radar screen showed something new. A vertical shaft rising from the deeper chamber. Not the tunnel we had used earlier. Another one. And it was heading directly toward the surface. Toward the southern sector of Camp Bastion. Right beneath the generator building where we were standing. The engineer stared at the screen. "That tunnel wasn't there 5 minutes ago." No one had an explanation for that. Because tunnels carved through rock don't appear in minutes. Unless something underground is digging them. Then the screaming stopped. Completely. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Because for the first time since this began, the ground beneath Camp Bastion felt still. Too still. Like whatever had been moving down there had reached its destination. And then something struck the underside of the concrete floor. Once. Hard. From directly below us. When the impact came, It didn't feel like an explosion. Explosions have a shockwave. A sharp crack that moves through the air and rattles everything at once. This was different. The concrete floor lifted slightly beneath our boots, like something enormous had pushed upward against it from below. Just one movement. Then it stopped. No cracking. No debris. Just a heavy vibration that faded through the generator building and into the ground beyond it. Everyone inside the structure froze. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the British radar technician whispered something that none of us wanted to hear. "It's directly under us." He rotated the radar screen so we could see it clearly. The shaft that had appeared moments earlier had extended upward. It stopped less than 2 meters beneath the concrete slab, directly under the building. But the disturbing part wasn't the tunnel. It was what the radar showed inside it. Movement. Several long shapes coiling slowly upward through the shaft. Not solid objects. More like distortions in the rock. But they were rising. The engineer leaned closer to the screen. "How many?" The technician zoomed in. The shapes shifted slightly. 1, 2, 3, then more. The distortions overlapped each other until the screen struggled to separate them. It looked less like separate forms and more like something layered. A mass moving together through the tunnel. Slow. Deliberate. Like it had all the time in the world. Outside the generator building, soldiers had formed a perimeter. I stepped out long enough to look across the base. Floodlights illuminated the southern sector in harsh white beams. Vehicles idled near the supply depot. 2 Apache helicopters sat on standby at the flight line. Everything about the scene looked like a normal security response. Except for the silence. No dogs. No wind. Just the low hum of generators and the occasional crackle of radios. Even the desert insects had stopped making noise. Inside the building, the radar technician spoke again. "It's not digging." Everyone looked at him. "What do you mean?" the British officer asked. He tapped the screen. "The shaft appeared because the ground moved." The explanation didn't make sense. Stone doesn't move. But the image on the radar screen suggested something else. The shaft hadn't been carved. The surrounding earth had simply shifted aside. Like something rising from below was displacing it. The screaming returned. But this time it wasn't coming from deep underground. It was coming from the shaft itself. The sound vibrated through the floor directly beneath us. Closer now. Clearer. A long human cry echoing through stone. Except there was something unnatural about the pitch. It wavered in strange patterns. As if several voices were layered together inside a single throat. One of the Marines stepped back from the radar screen. "Sergeant, if that thing breaks through..." He didn't finish the sentence. Because at that moment the concrete floor moved again. Not upward this time. Sideways. Just a fraction of an inch. But enough for everyone in the room to feel it. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. The generator hum flickered. And the screaming stopped. The radar screen went dark. Not blank. Just empty. The shapes inside the shaft vanished. The technician checked the system. The equipment was still working. The chamber beneath the base was still visible. But the movement inside it had disappeared. Whatever had been rising toward us was no longer in the shaft. The British officer immediately ordered a second scan across the southern sector. The radar unit swept outward from the generator building. Across the maintenance road. Across the drainage trench we had sealed earlier. Across the supply warehouse. Nothing moved beneath those structures. The deeper chamber was still there. But the distortions inside it had returned to the center. The same slow shifting patterns we had seen earlier. Like something pacing inside a cavern. "Where did the shaft go?" someone asked. The technician adjusted the depth filter again. The vertical tunnel was gone. The earth above the chamber had sealed itself. No visible passage. No break in the rock. Nothing. It looked exactly the way it should have looked before we arrived. Command eventually decided to shut down the investigation for the night. The official explanation was, Possible geological instability beneath the installation. That report satisfied exactly no one who had been in the generator building. But the base had bigger concerns. Aircraft operations. Perimeter security. Supply movement. War doesn't stop because the ground beneath you makes strange noises. So the southern sector was restricted and sealed off until morning. The radar team left their equipment in place. A small security detachment stayed behind to monitor the area. The rest of us were sent back to our quarters. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear. Soldiers learned to compartmentalize fear quickly. It was something else. A thought that kept repeating in the back of my mind. The chamber under Camp Bastion had been there long before the base existed. Long before the Soviets. Long before NATO. Possibly long before the modern villages of Helmand were even built. And the ancient symbols carved into the stone walls of that chamber had all pointed toward the well. As if someone had known something lived beneath it. Something that needed to be contained. Morning came with the usual desert heat. Helicopters lifted off from the runway. Supply trucks rolled through the gates. For most of the base, nothing had happened. But when our team returned to the generator building for a daylight inspection, we found something that hadn't been there the night before. A crack. Running across the concrete floor. Only about 2 feet long. Thin. Easy to miss. But it hadn't been there earlier. The engineer crouched down and brushed dust away from it. The concrete had split slightly along the seam. Not enough to cause structural damage. Just enough to reveal a narrow gap between the slabs. He leaned closer to look inside. Then he froze. I asked him what he saw. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly moved his flashlight beam along the crack. Inside the gap between the slabs was a fine layer of sand. And cutting through that sand was a single narrow track. The same kind we had seen in the tunnel. Long. Thin. Dragged through the dust. Except this one wasn't moving toward the crack. It was moving away from it. The track continued across the floor of the generator building. Across the concrete. Toward the open doorway. And then out into the base. That finding never made it into the official report. Within 48 hours, engineering crews poured a fresh layer of reinforced concrete across the entire southern sector foundation. The drainage trench was filled with gravel and sealed permanently. Ground radar surveys were classified. The chamber beneath Camp Bastion was marked on internal maps as a geological void of unknown origin. No excavation was ever authorized. Hamid transferred to another unit a few weeks later. Before he left, he told me something I still remember. In my village, he said, the elders say the desert keeps things buried for a reason. I asked him what they believed lived under places like that. He thought about the question for a long moment. Then he said something I've never been able to forget. They say the earth remembers every scream that has ever been buried in it. I rotated out of Afghanistan 3 months later. Camp Bastion was eventually dismantled after coalition forces withdrew. Most of the structures were removed. The concrete foundations were broken apart and hauled away. Today the desert has started reclaiming the site. Wind covers the gravel. Sand fills the empty spaces where buildings once stood. From the air it probably looks like nothing more than another abandoned patch of desert. Just dust and stone. But sometimes I think about the chamber that radar picked up beneath the base. 20 meters below the ground. Still sealed. Still waiting. And every now and then I wonder something that the officers in that debrief room never asked me. When the screaming stopped that night, was it because whatever lived down there decided to go back to sleep? Or because it finally learned the way out? The official archive closed the incident with a single sentence. No confirmed source of subterranean acoustic activity located beneath Camp Bastion. But the report never mentioned the track we found leaving the building. And the desert is very good at hiding things that move through it. Especially when they travel underground. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound from the tunnel. A distant human scream stretched thin by stone and time. And I can't help thinking about how long something like that would have to live. To learn how to scream like us.